Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast and everything you need to know to ride like a pro.
Fast Talk is sponsored by Quark, maker of Quark power meters and other kick-ass bicycle data systems. Quark power meters, Collector, and ShockWiz help you ride faster, improve your performance, and share your passion. Find out more at quark.com. Welcome back to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast. This is Trevor Connor, your friendly local training coach. I'm here with my usual co-host, Kaylee Fretz, and today we bring to you two very, very knowledgeable, well-known cycling coaches to talk to you about training. So our first guest is Frank Overton, who is the head of FasCat coaching here in Boulder, Colorado. And we also have Ryan Kohler, who is the head coach at the University of Colorado Sports and Performance Center. Did I get that right? Sports Medicine and Performance Center. Thank you. It is a mouthful. Our topic for today is to talk a little bit about interval work. We've already talked to you about slow volume versus intervals, but now we want to get a little more into the high intensity work and how to perform that. And part of the reason we have brought in Frank and Ryan is to introduce or to talk to you a little bit about two almost polar opposite approaches that are both showing a lot of different success. So Frank is one of the pioneers of what's called sweet spot training, and I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. Well, Ryan has in the past taken much more of what's called a polarized approach. Before we talk with Frank and Ryan, it would probably help if I gave a quick explanation of training zones. I know those terms are thrown out a lot on training rides. You're certainly going to hear them a lot in this podcast, but it's good to understand what we're talking about when we say zone 2 or zone 4. It might get a little bit confusing later on because Ryan's actually going to talk about polarized training, and he's going to talk about a 3-zone model. When you read the research, and a lot of the physiological research out there, they talk about 3 zones. Ryan's going to explain that, but for the most part during this podcast, we're referring to a 5 or 6 or 7 zone model. So let me explain what those are about. And to understand the zones, you first have to know that we have 2 thresholds. Everybody knows about that anaerobic threshold. That's what you time trial at. That's as hard as you can go aerobically, or think about that. It's your highest sustainable effort. Beyond that, you're gonna fatigue very rapidly. We also have what's called an aerobic threshold, which is about 85% of your anaerobic threshold. That's harder to feel, and it usually needs to be tested to find out exactly where that's at. So now let's talk about the zones in the context of these 2 thresholds. Your easiest zone is zone 1, and that's really what you do for a recovery ride. That's just very, very easy talking pace riding. Zone 2 is what you're going to hear a lot during the base season because that's a lot of your base work. It's getting right up towards that aerobic threshold or on that aerobic threshold. When I'm explaining it to an athlete, I say this is just slightly uncomfortable riding, but still something you can sustain for a very long period of time. Zone 3 is that range between your 2 thresholds. That's what we're going to be talking about when we say sweet spot training. Zone 4 is your anaerobic threshold. That's your time trial pace. That's what you're going to train at when you're doing threshold intervals. So that's really hard, but it's sustainable. It's your highest sustainable pace. Zone 5, and then in some models, 6, 7, even up to 8, those are all above anaerobic threshold intensities. So those are efforts that are very hard that you can only sustain for short periods of time. So anywhere from just a few seconds to maybe up to 5 minutes if your model differentiates VO2 max training as a zone 5. I hope that makes it a little clearer. I hope that gives you the information you need for this podcast. And with that, let's go to our experts.
Thanks, Trevor. So the sweet spot is as an intensity. It's a style of training. It's 84 to 97% of your functional threshold power, which produces a lot of physiological adaptations. But the sweet spot part of it is that it doesn't fatigue riders as much so that they can't train hard in the sweet spot the next day or the next day. The recovery is easier for athletes, and it enables them to do more training in successive days on the training plan, as opposed to like a threshold zone 4 effort. So prior to the sweet spot, we had tempo, we had zone 4 threshold, and tempo was pretty gravy for athletes. You weren't getting enough training adaptations, but then you'd go out and do a zone 4 workout, and the athlete would be just whacked the next day, and you can't. So you get like one good day of training. So the sweet spot originated, you could get like 2, 3, 4, 5 days of really good training. And when you'd go back and look at the power data, the cumulative numbers were much greater when you did sweet spot than opposed to tempo or zone 4 threshold.
As I remember correctly, you came up with this method of training, with this whole concept, along with Dr. Andy Coggins, who was one of the inventors of Training Peaks and wrote pretty much the definitive book on training with power. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So in 2003 and 4, when we were developing the performance manager chart, we as athletes or members of this group, there's probably a dozen of us, we were basically taking Andy's model and putting our data in it to let him know if it worked. And so we were out there training hard. I was training for like the state time trial and, the local races. And I would go out and train, come back, download my data, look at how the TSS and the CTL stacked up in the performance manager chart. And I was doing a ton of sweet spot because I was like trying to get a lot of TSS out of these rides. So I just did a boatload of TSS. I ramped my CTL up. I took it back down, and I peaked for the state road championships. And the intensity at which I rode a lot at was sweet spot. And it was, like I said, it wasn't threshold. It wasn't as hard as threshold, but it was harder than tempo.
And so for our listeners who don't know, what do you mean by TSS and CTL?
TSS is training stress score, and CTL is chronic training load. TSS is the individual metric for the amount of training you do in one training ride. It's calculated from your power data, normalized power and duration and intensity factor. Chronic training load is the cumulative training effect it's a rolling 42-day average of all your TSS. So if you ask your buddies, hey, how much have you been training lately? They'll be like, oh yeah, some. Or they could be like, well, my CTL is 90. And it's the same concept.
So Ryan, let's ask you a little bit about the polarized approach and what gravitated you towards that as a style of coaching.
Sure. I think, that approach, it sort of spoke to me just because, I've worked with a lot of athletes that are time crunched, and one of the difficulties is that they have trouble sometimes training at the appropriate intensity for the right amount of time. So with the polarized approach, the standard approach there is about 20% of your sessions are high intensity, and then the 80% would be more in that, zone 2 area. And the polarized approach, that's broken up into kind of more basics, basically like a 3-zone model. Zone 1, 2, some low tempo, as your zone 1. That zone 2 is kind of the middle area where you would run up from tempo into lactate threshold, and then above that.
So that would be the sweet spot range.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then that other part would be above threshold, near up to maximal effort. In that approach, you would spend a small amount of time, about 20% of your sessions above threshold, and then the rest of that time would be at somewhere in that base tempo recovery realm, depending, and I think Frank put it nicely before where he said, you're tired, but you're not tired enough to ride base. So that kind of speaks to that 80% time where, you might be really tired one time, so you need to go a little bit lower. You might not be very fatigued, so you can ride maybe a little more tempo and still maintain those aerobic adaptations.
You guys come at the same problem with two totally different solutions. So is there any overlap between the two methods? I mean, it sounds to me, if I'm trained by Ryan, I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of sort of sweet spot style training. I'm going to be either going really, really hard or really easy. Frank, you would have me doing a lot of the sweet spot stuff, and I would guess not a whole lot of other types of intervals, or do you work other stuff in? Is there some overlap here? Do you sort of take ideas from each other, or each camp take ideas from the other?
Yeah, I think there's a time and a place for everything, and it's I think what you bring up is other types of intervals. I'm a huge proponent of VO2, anaerobic, Tabata intervals, a lot of intensity. But then you're getting into the training plan. And so when if you go way back and you want to, talk about building a base, the pyramid foundation that, Joe Friel likes to tout. I mean, I'm an absolute believer in that. And when I use Sweet Spot to build up that base measured by TSS and CTL. And when I'm comfortable that the athlete, we shift from trying to raise training load to resting up the athlete, leveling off that training load, and then we'll shift over to the race-specific intensity, whether that's threshold or VO2, anaerobic, Tabata, motor pacing, group rides, the works. That it just depends on the time of the year. And we still have our athletes do a lot of just plain Jane Zone 2 endurance work, especially when they're tired. It's like, okay, you're tired, but you're not tired enough to rest. Let's do some Zone 2. When in doubt, always ride Zone 2.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's I think season specific sort of part of you in the year, and I use a lot of Sweet Spot earlier on, and like Frank said, I think to build that training load, it's there's definitely a time and a place for it. I've worked with a lot of the time crunched athletes, or just athletes where they have some difficulty in focusing on that. So I find that sometimes we just step back from and say, okay, let's do some hard intervals, have fun with that, and then because I think it takes a lot of focus to do certain a Sweet Spot workout and to go day after day. I mean, it's hard. So but I think there's that definitely a give and take and just finding what works for the athlete.
So is there anything in particular, any particular performance or an athlete that you came across or just accumulated knowledge that sort of led you toward the methods that you've started using? Do you have an anecdote or do you have a data set or something like that versus some of the other options that are out there? I mean, because obviously there are lots of different ways to get fast on a bicycle. What was it in particular that made you go with what you believe?
I think for me, it was a little bit of personal experience, which I think that drives every coach. I mean, when I was younger, I hated threshold. I hated that whole area. I never did enough of it. And so everything was really hard or really easy. And there was good success from that. And then I've seen that also work with some athletes where we've done very intensified training blocks of high intensity. And then, very light days after that. And it worked well, but there was a deficit. I know, going back to personal experience, there was a deficit at threshold. If it was long and sustained, I was in trouble, but should have probably been racing on the track at that time, not trying to do road races and things. So, but I think that helped to drive it. And that's sort of what got me going, was short, hard, on, off type of efforts like that, and just enjoyed it. And it kept me on the bike. It kept me fun, kept me motivated. It was enjoyable. Yeah, that was a big thing for me.
So a big part of your preferred method is the mental aspect then? Is you believe that certain athletes probably respond better to the sort of high-low approach, the polarized approach mentally?
I think some do, yeah. I mean, it's some athletes enjoy that. And then, going back to how I started, one of the things I would change is, find a better balance between that and the threshold, the threshold approach, and riding more Sweet Spot, things like that. That would have helped to develop more completely as an athlete. But I think generally the short, high intensity stuff is fun. And if it keeps people motivated and gets them on the bike and looking forward to it, then I think it's a good resource.
About you, Frank, what sent you? You kind of explained the origins of Sweet Spot at the beginning of the podcast, but was there anything in particular? Was it your own experience? Was it the experience of a particular athlete that sort of made something click in your head and said, "This is the way that I think that most riders should be doing it, or at least the riders that I'm going to work with are going to do it"?
Yeah, it started with my own personal training, coaching myself, using the power data. I was able to achieve a true peak performance in the state time trial. That was my goal that year, and we had been experimenting with Sweet Spot. It was regular testing, watching the data, watching your power go up from the sweet spot training, and then applying it to athletes, analyzing their data, watching their power go up. And it worked for a lot of athletes. So we kept doing it. We tried it with masters, with pros, everybody in between, and everyone was getting faster. So kept using it. Sometimes if an athlete is, like Ryan hinted at, and you did too, the mental aspect of it, honestly, sweet spot shouldn't be that difficult mentally. It depends on how much you prescribe. I mean, I have this workout called Freestyle Sweet Spot. And I tell riders, I'm like, all right, I want you to go out, just drill it for 3 hours. It's a 5-hour ride. That one's difficult mentally because the first hour and a half is not that bad, but then you start to fatigue, run out of glycogen, and you have to bear down. Those guys hated me. They got a lot faster. I would not give that workout to a Cat 3 or a Masters athlete. It all depends. It goes back to the training plan and the amount of sweet spot you prescribe. Prescribing 3 hours of sweet spot is huge. But, if you look at like the Paris-Roubaix file that came out this year, Matthew Heyman, guess what he did for 5.5 hours?
Sweet spot.
Yeah, it was like
that's basically a race, right? And 3 hours of sweet spot is an amateur. It's a Cat 2, Cat 1 road race.
Yeah. So then now you're getting into race specificity. Can you do this for 3 hours? Are you a mountain biker? Do you need to do this for 3 hours? Or, a lot of the Masters racing, short races, they get after it. I mean, they're hard. When you look at the power data, it's like 95% of your FTP and you're hanging on for dear life. That's what I know where I was going. For Masters athletes that may find sweet spot difficult, it's like, let's start with 30 minutes worth. Let's get you stronger from that and then introduce 40 minutes, 45, maybe work your way up to about an hour. I have a training tip where it's titled, How Much Sweet Spot Should You Do? And it's broken out into your ability level, and naturally it goes up per your ability level. And, it's pretty small if you're a category 4 or, maybe a 50-plus rider.
So let's take some of these concepts you're talking about and try to put this into what this would look like a bit. And I'm going to give a qualifier here that understand completely what makes both of you great coaches is you don't have this template plan that you just hand to every athlete and say, go do this. That part of great coaching is learning every athlete and really tailoring to that athlete. And certainly anybody who's looking to hit a high level in the sport should be hiring coaches like you. But with that qualifier, let's take your average, let's say, Masters athlete who's maybe a Cat 4, Cat 3 type level. They're getting ready, say, for the state championships. Looking at the sweet spot and the polarized approach, what would their season basically look like? And what would be similar and what would be different between the two approaches? And could you possibly, I know you're going to be a little uncomfortable with this, but just...
Can we use the whiteboard?
Yeah, sure. We'll point the microphone at the whiteboard. Everybody see this?
I can draw it out.
But could you map out something basic just to get a bit of an understanding of how the polarized approach would look versus how the sweet spot approach would look?
Yeah, and I think it also gets into training methods too. I mean, that can bring us into the more block training versus like the traditional approach. And yeah, very open question. Thank you. So, but yeah, I mean, broadly, I look at it as you have that base time period, you build the foundation, and I think that at that point, yeah, include sweet spot for sure. Zone 2, building that aerobic fitness. And then, there's that intensifying period where you start to do some more high intensity. That might be VO2, things like that.
So when you say a VO2, for our listeners who wouldn't know, what would a VO2 interval look like?
So like a 4 to 5 minute interval would be one. You might do like a 4x4, 5x5, 6x4 minutes. So 6 intervals of 4 minutes, something along those lines. But generally like that, 3, 4, 5 minute range is a good place that I consider that to be VO2. So something like that where it's above threshold, and then that phase where they start to peak for an event, and that's where shorter high intensity intervals, maximal intervals would come in. Just building through those ranges, and then of course adjusting the workouts to be more specific as they get closer to whatever the event is.
Okay. Right.
What was the question again?
So we're talking
Just
about
Find your overarching theory in 2 minutes.
we're just what it would it's what it would look like. Taking your average masters athlete, Cat 3, Cat 4 level, they're getting ready for, say, the state championship, so that's one of their target events. What would their season look like? What sort of work specifically would they be doing?
Yeah, working backwards from the event, if we have time, I'll allow 2 to 6 weeks of high intensity work prior to the first goal event. And that's not including, that's not raising training load, CTL. That's just raw race specific intensity. It can include a racing block, a stage race. It can include a training camp, but it's going to a lot of intervals during the week.
And when you say high intensity, what are the intervals looking like? Are these threshold intervals, above threshold?
Zone 4, 5, and 6. It really depends on the athlete. Higher on the zone 6 if they're a crit racer or a track rider. Definitely zone 4 if they're a time trialist or a mountain biker. I'll have mountain bikers do a boatload of zone 6. VO2 if they're road racers. Everyone can benefit from VO2, so that's a staple. But yeah, just race specificity, depending on what the athlete's goal is, what the terrain is like of that goal event. But so working back, it kind of depends on how much time you have. If you don't have a lot of time and their training load is just wasn't that good to begin with, sometimes I'll just sweet spot them and march them up as high as I can 2 weeks prior to the event. And then just rest them up and give them like a week of intervals. And that, at that point, that you're doing the best you can. It really depends on how much time you have. If you plan it out, if you do 6 or 9 months in advance and you are able to get in all that sweet spot, the base, beforehand, it's nice to stop doing that switch and decrease fatigue. It's that ATL, that acute training load. Yeah. Give rest preference, and then really hit out on these intervals. Concentrate on being fresh for these workouts, motivated, rested. And this is where the training plan comes in. And it could be like Monday, Tuesday off, super easy. And then Wednesday is like a really hard workout. And you can start off with an introductory amount of intensity. And then as the athlete goes through the rest cycles week to week, you can introduce a higher volume of intensity week after week so that you're walking them up this periodized amount of intensity.
All right, time for a quick break.
Fast Talk is sponsored by Quark, maker of the next generation D0 power meter platform. D0 is packed with 10 years of technical innovations. It also offers a choice of Bluetooth, low energy, or ANT plus data transmission, and broader compatibility. Get the Power Meter chassis or the D0 Power Meter Spider for power-ready OEM bikes. Find out more at quark.com/D0.
Now, you said if you plan out ahead of time, you can do that base work, which is a lot of sweet spots. So what would their base phase look like? What would be their primary work?
In a traditional weekly training plan model, Tuesday sweet spot, Wednesday tempo, Thursday zone 2. I call it a fatigue dependent model. You just go with the grain of the fatigue. So you do your most high powered, harder, most difficult workout following a rest day, presumably Monday. But a lot of that, it depends on what the athlete has. Group rides a lot of time wind up being a lot of sweet spot,
right?
Which is nice. A lot of climbing is also very good for sweet spot tempo. So we'll really concentrate on TSS a lot of times. And it's like, all right, let's maximize the amount of training you have. If you've got an hour at lunch, let's go do an hour of power. mostly sweet spot.
Right. So they're not doing in the base a lot above sweet spot. They're not doing those zone 5, 6 workouts. It's all below threshold.
Sub-thresh. Not even. For the motivated athlete that tends to be impatient and really maybe train a little bit harder than he or she should at that time of year, I'll really emphasize, let's stay away from zone 4. And you have to do that on the group rides. So you have to know the strength of the group ride relative to the ability level of the athlete.
Right.
The Cat 1s, 2s, you can send them out on group rides and just, hey, let's do some sitting in. I don't want you to do any attacking, no counterattack. This is just some good miles with company. But if you send a master or a Cat 4 or a Cat 3 to that group ride, you can count on a lot of TSS.
Yes.
And that's a good tool. It's a very good tool. You might have to coach them along the way of like, hey, let's not suffer for more than 10 minutes at a time and really, really dig deep here in January. Why don't you just self-drop yourself? This is not a race, and find a group of athletes that have come off the group. Group rides are tremendous for that. But yeah, no zone 4 at all.
So Ryan, how do you feel about that? Do you believe in any sort of above threshold work in the base season, or do you think it should all be kept lower as well?
Yeah, I mean, lower for the most part, but then I do subscribe to that block theory. Zone 4, I agree. I minimize that. Completely. If you can take it out completely, perfect. In the base phase, I do like some shorter type of intervals, 15, 30 seconds, things like that. Short sprints, short efforts like that can complement that aerobic development well. And you could do things like, even neuromuscular type of workouts, big gear things, where the power might be up into those higher zones, but you're not doing like a focused zone 4 workout where you're going to be just really blown after that. But yeah, short stuff in zone 5 and a little bit above for short time periods, I think complement that base really well.
So both of you have mentioned avoid the zone 4 workout. What, for our listeners who might not know, what would you describe as zone 4?
2x20s, full gas.
So
3x10, full gas.
Right at that anaerobic threshold?
Yeah, 97 to 104%. Okay. Yeah. I'd like to echo what Ryan said about the neuromuscular work. We absolutely have athletes do that. The 15-second, bursty cadence work. That's really good for athletes to do. I wouldn't exactly call that building the base, but it's a good thing to do in the off season. But getting back to the group rides, I do like for athletes, I like the bursty nature of group rides for training during the base period. It keeps them sharp. But what I don't want to have happen is it just turn into like this death march, hang on for dear life, suffer and hate cycling, and it kind of goes to some mental periodization where
Right.
I don't want them to peak it's the group ride hero, It's like, just let yourself get dropped and find a suitable group to ride with.
When Kaylee and I were up in Fort Collins, there was a local group ride there that went all winter, and there was one rider who was a Masters athlete that everybody in Fort Collins worshipped because he would just destroy this group ride all through January and February. And they would say, so everybody would try to mimic his training. And when I'd say, you shouldn't be going full gas at a group ride in December, they go, well, look how well he does. And my response would always be, how's he do during the race season? Oh, we've never seen him at a race. You go, right. His season's January and February. That's why he's winning the group ride.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, group ride hero.
Frank, you've been talking a lot about power meters. Is there, I would assume that probably many of our listeners have power meters, but not all. At the very least, they probably have access to a heart rate monitor, which are very cheap these days. Is either one of these methods more or less conducive to a rider without a power meter? Because obviously they both work very well if you have one. You can sit right in the zones that you need to sit in. But for example, is a polarized approach easier if you don't have a power meter, or is a sweet spot approach easier if you don't have a power meter, just either based purely off of feel or heart rate, or something that's not still $500-$600?
I'd say the Polarized approach is easier with a heart rate monitor. Zone 2, I have athletes use heart rate over wattage in zone 2 a lot of times because that's what's going on in their body. And then I look to see if their wattage was zone 2 at those heart rates. Since Sweet Spot relies so heavily on TSS and CTL, if you don't have power data, I would worry that the athlete is going too hard relative to the fatigue. It's more difficult to coach an athlete without a power meter. It really is. And it sounds self-serving, but I would probably have to take a more conservative, polarized approach to their training without a power meter.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we've done it for years without power and heart rate, but once we started to get those tools, I think it really helped us. There you go. It really helped us achieve what we wanted with our athletes easier. It was easier to coach them, easier to teach them. They can learn on their own too once they see that data. Yeah, I mean, I think we can, but it's very difficult. And I would agree, with Frank on Sweet Spot because it's such a narrow range compared to the whole spectrum, and what we're looking for is very particular in that. So it's difficult to do. Even if they have a really good sense for their body, it's still not perfect without power or heart rate.
Let's actually talk for a minute with Phil Guyman, who is now a retired Pro Tour rider. He's worked pretty much his whole cycling career with Frank and has a lot to say about the coach-athlete relationship.
Frank's job is to tell me I'm supposed to feel, and I tell him how I do feel. And generally those mesh up. Frank's, I've been with him a long time. I was with him 1 year, and I was like, I'm going to write out my career with this guy. He knows what he's doing, and I like him.
Yeah, he really went into TSS when I interviewed him, so it'll I think
that's his job. The coach's job is to assume that the athlete is doing their job, which is minimizing the other factors. And my job would be to be like, hey man, like here's why I need an extra 2 hours tomorrow because I ate a deep dish pizza, or I had a girl over last night and I need today off. That's all my responsibility.
Probably won't put this in, but I got to tell you, I interviewed Phil a couple of days ago, and he did Frank loves that TSS. I like to go by how I feel. Finished the interview, and I went, so is Frank going to get rid of you after I put these quotes in the article? He actually had a good response. He's like, no, it's Frank's job to analyze all that stuff. My job is to ride the way I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame them. Those guys ride their bikes so much to have that power meter staring at them in the face 30 hours a week when you're completely wrecked from a stage race and your coach is saying you should train. Yeah, you don't really care if you're hitting your TSS or Sweet Spot. It's like, dude, I'm tired. So I always listen to the athlete over the power data. The science and the art is taking what they're saying and blending it with what the data is telling you. But from a mental perspective, Phil, if I could now make a comment back to that, if I had been in on that conversation, there are some days where he lights it up and killer training rides. And then he's like, hey, look at the TSS. I'm like, well, hell yeah.
So the other thing that won't go in the article, but I will say, so I don't start a fight here, is one of the first things he said, first conversation I had with Frank, I could tell he knew what he was talking about, and he was my coach for life. So he did say that.
Oh, well, that was a very nice compliment.
So I want to hit you with kind of a hard question, but this is actually something I was really researching for an article that I read recently that does relate to what we were just talking about. There's a lot of research coming out right now, and some scientists who are now saying, you know what, and I'll give you some examples before I ask you guys to answer. They're saying the different types of interval work, the different types of work just doesn't matter. So, for example, there was the Broussard study that just came out this year, 2016, where they had athletes either doing 5 to 7 minute intervals at 85% of their VO2 max. So that put them around threshold, maybe a little below. I had another group doing 30-second, more Tabata-style intervals. I had them train for 6 weeks, and the improvements were identical. Not only aerobic improvements, but they had equal anaerobic improvements. We've all seen all the research on sprint intervals, where if you remember the whole surprise when people are doing sprint intervals and seeing dramatic improvements in their endurance. And then you even have the biochemical review by Larson, who really showed that all these different types of work all ultimately funnel in on PGC1 alpha, which then regulates the endurance adaptation. So since they all go through the same pathway, it really doesn't matter. Just do a ton of work. You can do sprints, you can do thresholds, you can do endurance work. It just all produces the same gain, so who cares? How do you two feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of our job as coaches is to distill all that information and then, prescribe the correct amount to the athlete based on their needs. I mean, there's a specificity principle, and that's big for any athlete.
But basically what all this research is saying is that specificity doesn't exist.
Well, specificity for their events, not the physiology. That's how I look at it that way. Yeah, I mean, we can get mitochondrial adaptation through carbohydrate restriction, but that doesn't mean that they're going to race any better. So we could do, I think we have to tailor those workouts to say, okay, if you're going to race a crit, then you need this kind of training versus if you're just doing a recreational century ride, for example, we would train you a different way. And those two people might come out with very similar adaptations physically, but the way we get them there is, I think, where that art of coaching comes into play.
Frank, do you agree, or how do you feel about all this research that's coming out?
I think they're flawed studies.
Okay.
No,
bold statement.
I think this is a great example where the laboratory data diverges from what happens in real life. And I would hope that my athletes compete against the athletes that follow whatever is coming out of the lab in these studies, because I'm 99.789% sure that they'll beat them every time. And also the specificity, so we're talking about specificity, there's no such thing. Is that so
basically what these studies are getting at is exactly that. In terms of training adaptations, you can do sprints, you can do threshold work, and you're going to get pretty much the same adaptations. It's more talking in terms of the different types of interval work. Should you be doing the 5-minute VO2 intervals, and should you be doing the longer, what you were calling the zone 4 workouts, or should you be doing sprints and Tabatas? Basically, a lot of these studies are coming out and saying, you know what, they're all the same gains. Pick your interval, go have fun.
Well, as long as they're going as hard as they can, I can see something to that. I do think there's a mental aspect of specificity. Like, take Rio, for example. That was a 8K climb. I'm pretty sure Mara Abbott did a lot of 8K climbed intervals or broke them up. I mean, and that's a mental aspect. She knows she needs to go hard for that length of time, full gas. I mean, she would not be doing 1-minute intervals or intervals of a different length. Maybe she did, but I think you get my point. But yeah, if you're doing state road race in Oklahoma and there's a 5-minute crosswind section, you should do 5-minute VO2s. It's like practice how you want to play. I don't know. I don't think you can prove that in the laboratory or get data out of that. Should ask a sports psychologist.
Right. With saying that almost any interval does that, I think we also see that when we see these athletes in the lab, where they see that and they say, oh, good, I can go do anything. I feel like sprints today. I feel like threshold tomorrow. Great. But then I feel like we see a lot of athletes in our physiology lab that come in under-recovered, or there's a few other things that could be going on, or they're just not resting enough. And to say that when athletes are sort of given that blanket statement to say, maybe intervals, you could do whatever you want, I think they also run the risk of overcooking themselves. And then that's where we see that in the data down the road anyway. And that's where we end up bringing them back and say, okay, let's periodize your training a bit more so that you can get more rest, because the rest is a big part of it too.
So are you also then saying that, let's even suppose there is some truth to this and you can interchange intervals a bit. Is it a good idea for an athlete to say, you know what, today I'm going to go do threshold intervals. Tomorrow or in a couple of days I'll do Tabatas. Then maybe I'll do sprints and just, you can do any type of interval. So why don't you do them all through a week? Or do you feel, yeah, you might get similar training adaptations, but pick one. Do sprints, do them for 6 weeks, or pick thresholds, do those for 6 weeks. Can you mix them up, or should you really be picking one and really focusing on it?
I like to mix it up unless the athlete is absolutely laser focused on one event. And some athletes do just train for one event, whether it's a Fondo or a state time trial or a road race. If they were doing just the state time trial, I would even have them do some VO2 and anaerobic work, because if you can tap into those energy systems and derive power from your anaerobic system to contribute to your threshold system, it's not like a light switch, it's a dimmer switch, and you derive power from all sorts of the 3 energy pathways. So if they're weak in the anaerobic department because they're a really good time trialist, you can have them do 1-minute intervals, begin to derive some power there and take their power up to the next level. So I will have even athletes that have a laser focus on one specific event that you would think necessitates like all threshold. I'll still keep it pretty well rounded. And same thing for criterium racers. You think just sprint, anaerobic all day long, but they can also benefit from threshold work too.
It seems to me that if we are supposing that these studies are correct and that essentially you can go out and get the same end of the line adaptation from a whole bunch of different types of intervals, that really places the I guess it would make the coaching even more important, because then at that point you are essentially just figuring out how to run up against that fatigue wall still properly, right? Even if they all produce the exact same result, you still have that fatigue wall that you run up against and the time issues that you run up against. And so sort of regardless, you still have to tailor these programs for an athlete. Am I right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think left to their own devices, we see that athletes typically under recover, and that's where we need to just figure out that approach of how can we get them motivated, get them to enjoy what they're doing so they continue doing it. And if it's a mixture of intervals, then that's great. If we do something like that, I still think there's a point where you need to have some sort of a focused time period to say, okay, we need to get down to brass tacks, and this is what's going to help you for your event. And maybe it's a shorter time period, but there's definitely give and take in there.
So it definitely sounds like you two feel that you don't fully agree with the studies. You do feel there are benefits to the different types of intervals. And there really are different classes. So you have your sprint intervals, you have your Tabata style intervals, which are those very short 20, 40-second all-out efforts with even shorter recoveries. You have those 4 or 5-ish minute VO2 max intervals. You have threshold intervals, and then you have sweet spot work. When would you recommend each? What if you have an athlete come to you? What sort of weaknesses or areas would you be targeting with each type of interval, if that makes sense?
When we look at the lower end of that spectrum, we're looking at more of those aerobic gains or fat oxidation, and that's going to be more through that zone 1 up to even toward that sweet spot. We go threshold point above that into that zone 4 area where we look at, are they able to buffer that reduced pH in the body? Are they able to tolerate those higher levels of lactate? How long can they sustain that? You go above it, and it's working on that glycolytic capacity, that anaerobic glycolytic, where it's how can you tap into that carbohydrate storage that you have, and and then can you recover from it? So from the longer intervals, and then as we get higher and higher, we get those shorter intervals, all the way up to zone 5, zone 6, very short sprint efforts. We're tapping into different energy systems and different capabilities in the body. So from that aerobic at the low end all the way up to that glycolytic anaerobic capacity at the top end. And generally I find with athletes, they're usually deficient aerobically because they tend to come in not doing enough base work. They tend to fall into a little bit of tempo, a little bit of threshold, and they don't have it very well organized yet. So we tend to focus a lot on that aerobic component. And then by doing that and getting more rest, by pulling out some of that threshold time and organizing it better, then it allows us to have them, do even better work at around threshold in that sweet spot area, and then do even better work above threshold so they can really get into that race pace.
Frank, how about you? When you're having your athletes do high intensity, how do you pick which type of interval work you want them to do?
Race specificity. We know the power demands of all the disciplines of cycling races now with years of power data. So it really just comes down to, are they a crit racer? This is what they have to do from a power demand standpoint. This is what they should do with their intervals. And that's mostly anaerobic and Tabata style intervals. Mountain bikers, same thing, anaerobic work. But then mountain bikers have a lot of climbing, so that's steady, sustained threshold, a lot of threshold work. Road racers, VO2s, it depends on the road race, maybe. But yeah, we just look at the power demands of the race and apply that to the training.
Okay. So you really, with your athletes then, you really want to know what type of races they're doing. You want to know what their target events are, and it's really tailoring them to those types of events.
Absolutely. And then knowing their strengths and weaknesses, which you're going to find out through working with them. You train your weaknesses and you maximize your strengths. If they're super good at threshold, if they're a time trialist that wants to do well in a road race that has a couple of punchy climbs, we'll concentrate on the power demands of those punchy climbs, VO2s and some anaerobic work. And, maybe not focus so much on their, the threshold intervals because they're already good at that. And also, inevitably, a road racer will get in a situation, even a mountain biker will get in a situation where they have to sprint at the end to beat that one person. And man, do they wish they had done some sprint work. So once in a while, if I can squeeze that in, and I'll tell them that, and that becomes a learning point. It's like you're going to get in a situation where you need to out-sprint one guy to get the win or the result you want, and that's why we're doing these. And I know you're a mountain biker, and there's no such thing as sprinting in mountain biking, but we're doing it.
And probably a point of confidence as well. If you know you've done your sprint work, you come up against one guy at the finish line, you're like, I got this fool, right?
That's right. I'm gonna be Peter Sagan and sit on his wheel and pimp him at the end.
It was great to have Ryan and Frank on the podcast today. I like having differing viewpoints, and those two are sort of from, I don't want to say opposite, but from different ends of the coaching spectrum these days. That was another episode of Fast Talk. As always, we love your feedback. Email us at webletters@competitorgroup.com. Subscribe to Fast Talk on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. And be sure to leave us a rating and a comment. While you're there, check out our sister podcast, the Velo News Podcast, which covers news, racing news and analysis and things like that. And I am also on that podcast if you just love the sound of my voice. Become a fan of Fast Talk on Facebook at facebook.com/VeloNews, on Twitter at twitter.com/VeloNews, and you can personally follow Trevor and I on Twitter at Kaylee Fretz and at Coach_T Connor. Fast Talk is produced by VeloNews, which is owned by Competitor Group. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. For Trevor Connor, I am Kaylee Fretz. Thanks for listening.